I wanted to kick off by asking you, if possible, to define core knowledge.
Well, I need a little bit of history. Uh, Core knowledge was first called cultural literacy, and it had very much a national orientation. Is in the American speech community, what is it that people take for granted in educated circles when they communicate with each other? Because just at that time, I had found out from researchers in psycholinguistics that a heck of a lot of knowledge is taken for granted in speech. And between the haves and have-nots in the United States, the big distinction was between those who had that taken for granted knowledge and those that didn't. And so cultural literacy, with its orientation to literacy, was originally how do we give everybody the taken for granted knowledge they need to communicate?
And why do you think it's important that all children should have this taken for granted knowledge?
Well, since it's a function of communication and since we live in a democracy, it's darn important for people to be able to communicate with each other. That raises further issues about knowledge and sentiment in respect to your civic duties as a citizen in a democracy. But basically, it was to achieve economic fairness as well, because there's money in your pocket if you're able to write well, communicate well, and learn well. By the way, it's not just being able to understand what people are saying, but also to understand what people are saying in writing, including in your textbooks and your subject matters.
And you think of this as a liberal argument for what, over here at any rate, and probably in America too, is often portrayed as a conservative educational philosophy.
It's a thing that's troubled me throughout my whole, some now 30-year effort in education reform, that the subject gets quickly polarized and subject to ideology. And not always, not in every person, but it shouldn't be that way, because there is an agreement, at least I think, among both liberals and conservatives, that there's an agreement that we have to narrow the achievement gap between advantaged and disadvantaged children. Everybody says we have to do that. The difficulty comes when you follow a logical chain of argument to say this is what we need to do if you want to narrow the achievement gap. And if you don't do this, you won't narrow the achievement gap.
How do you feel about the fact that your approach has got more traction amongst conservatives than amongst liberals within the educational community? I mean, it's been taken up here to a great extent by Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for Education. Previous Education Minister Nick Gibb was a great champion of core knowledge. But it hasn't had nearly so much take-up on the left of British politics, and I imagine the same is true in America.
The same is true in the United States. Of course, I can talk about the United States. I'm not familiar with the British situation, but in this country, the reason conservatives took up the cause of core knowledge, cultural literacy, and the liberals didn't. It's a little bit complex, but basically it's because what I was advocating looked like an old-fashioned curriculum filled with a lot of year-by-year facts and with traditional reading matters and all the rest. And this was happening at the very time when multiculturalism was coming to the fore. And this was a highly nationalistic, monocultural orientation, even though American culture is composed of a lot of strands. Still, it was very American-centric. And so it was seen as a kind of attempt to, a reactionary effort, to go back to the old days of schooling. And of course, that's correct. But I tried to make the point, though the point was drowned out, that you have to be conservative if you're in education, if your aim is socially progressive. That's because language and the taken for granted knowledge in communication changes very slowly, no matter how loud you yell from your soapbox. It's very slow to change. Literate culture is. I mean, you can't change what's written down in all those books in the libraries. So the socially progressive movement was running up against this conservatism of literacy, you might say. Literacy itself has a kind of conservative, slow to change character. And that little equation, that is, to be educationally conservative is not to be politically conservative, but quite the contrary, as Gramsci pointed out, is the key to the whole argument, I think. And there was an over hasty movement on the part of both liberals and conservatives to make an ideological identification with this argument.
Often, along with the multicultural argument that core knowledge is too monocultural, goes a postmodernist critique of knowledge itself, that all knowledge is really just the ruling class's attempt to assert its power. And if you teach a traditional body of knowledge to ordinary students, you'll somehow be colonizing them and turning them into serfs of the ruling class.
Yes, well, actually, it seems to me, if you think about it, the argument goes just the other way, that if you teach the serfs the language of the master class, they have the potential to become part of the master class. And that argument seems to have gotten lost. I mean, that's Gramsci's argument, and it is obviously true that you can't put money in your pocket or have power, if you can't communicate and can't learn.
Another argument I encounter a lot here from critics of the new national curriculum, which the Secretary of State for Education wants to introduce next year, and which has quite a lot in common with the core knowledge curriculum, is that it's all very well for people in the top half of the ability spectrum, the more able students, to be able to absorb this rich, detailed body of knowledge. But if you expect people in the lower half of the ability spectrum to absorb it, you're just going to end up alienating them.
I think that's an experiment, an empirical claim, and the evidence is all against that claim. If you go to the inner city where we have core knowledge schools, you find that these children are absorbing this material with enthusiasm, and not just the ones at the top end of the ability scale. Everybody likes facts. Kids like facts. It's only education experts who seem not to like facts. But particularly in the lower grades, I'm very sympathetic to the critical thinking movement, particularly as it applies to the later grades. But in early grades, kids, they're able to think quite critically about things they're aware about. Experimentation has shown that. But they have to have the information before they can think critically. And to give them the information is empowering. The whole anti-fact tradition has no real scientific basis to back it up. And let me ask, if I may ask a question of you, since I don't know the British situation. People who are criticizing a fact-based early education must be offering some kind of alternative, but is the alternative different from what you've been doing? And presumably, there's an interest in education reform because you're not satisfied with the outcomes. I'd like a little insight into that side of things. I mean, if what you've been doing hasn't been working, why are you arguing for doing it some more?
Yeah, well, very good point. I'm sure that many of the objections made by the defenders of the present national curriculum over here are familiar to you. One kind of cluster of objections is around, well, who should define what knowledge should be taught? because there's a general reluctance to get into the nitty-gritty of that debate. The feeling is that let's park that question and just teach children the skills which will enable them to access all knowledge without prescribing in advance what knowledge they ought to be learning. So in this way, in the present national curriculum anyway, there's much more emphasis on learning skills, on the tools children will need in order to become successful lifelong learners, rather than actually trying to impart knowledge.
Well, I go back to my initial question, has that theory been working? And I would hazard the guess that it hasn't, because the theory itself is in conflict with what cognitive psychology has found out about your ability to access knowledge from the internet and so on. I thought of one experiment that would be rather interesting to conduct in that respect. Suppose you made your reading tests. Our kids are doing very badly now on reading tests at school leaving age. And just give them some passages that you get off the internet from Wikipedia or from elsewhere in Google and say, okay, here, now I want you to answer A, B, C on these passages and see if they can actually read them. And the answer is no, of course, they can't read them. That's why they're making low reading scores. So how are the kids going to access all this richness on the web if, in fact, they can't really access it with understanding?
Yeah, talk a bit more about cognitive psychology, because in cultural literacy, you make a largely political argument for the teaching of core knowledge, which is that in order to give children from ordinary backgrounds the same sort of opportunities as children from well-off backgrounds, they need to be taught this taken-for-granted knowledge which well-off pupils pick up in the home and elsewhere, even if they don't pick it up at school. In my view, certainly a persuasive argument, but you've now buttressed that argument with research from the realm of cognitive psychology. Tell me a bit about how that's supported your overall point of view.
Right. Well, that's very true. There are two research programs in cognitive psychology that I was really basing core knowledge on. One strand is the strand we've been talking about, which is the need for unspoken, unwritten knowledge in order to understand what's written down or what's spoken. The other strand is talking about the nature of skills themselves, more generally, expertise, how to play chess and the rest. And that strand of research in cognitive psychology has discovered that you can't sort of subtract the formal skill from the operation. That is, somebody who does very well. Chess was the sort of path-breaking example. Chess masters who can identify and reproduce a position on a chessboard do terribly when they have to remember a position on a chessboard that wasn't actually created in a game. And that was because they had memories of games and knew how boards looked after certain, in a middle game and an end game and so on. But even more to the point, they found that if you give a person a problem with a subject matter that they're familiar with, and then give them a problem with an identical structure, but with an unfamiliar subject matter, they do very poorly on the second experiment. So that there's a kind of constitutive character to skills. That's a sort of Kantian term. There's a that the actual subject matter of the skill is wrapped up with the skill itself, and can't really, our minds don't work that way. You can't really subtract the formal skill and apply it to any given subject matter. So what that means is that these skills are knowledge dependent, or as they say in the psychological literature, domain specific. And these domain specific skills, that's the second strand of research. That is, you need knowledge in order to be skilled in any field. So that there's a double whammy in favor of knowledge there. I mean, in one case, you need this background knowledge to understand what people are saying, to understand what your textbooks are saying, and so on. The other strand is that if you want to be a skilled person, you have to be deeply factually knowledgeable in the field that your skill is involved with. You can't just apply these formal skills to new subject matter.
Have you found that being able to call on this body of research in cognitive psychology has enabled you to make more converts within the educational establishment? Has that proved a more persuasive way of making?
I wish it had been. I think the way I'm seeing to the extent that there are conversions within the educational community, I think it's because what our dear ex-president of Core Knowledge used to say, Gerald Terrell, he used to say that, well, Don, they're going to come round because they've tried everything else. And I think that some of it is, but I don't want to underestimate, I don't want to be too anti-intellectual about it. I do think that the persuasiveness of this cognitive psychology is now coming into the general ken a little bit more. And so I think there may be some, I hope that there will be some persuasive character to the implications of cognitive research.
One of the ways in which you tried to advance this cause has been to set up the Core Knowledge Foundation and become quite entrepreneurial in a way that most intellectuals and academics aren't. Was that a bit of a departure for you when you set up the Core Knowledge Foundation? What prompted you to do that?
It was a big departure. I had intended to lead out my old age as a theorist of hermeneutics. And it was, I did this in the late 70s because we were doing some experimentation that actually got published in Referee Journal, which showed that kids can understand passages, no matter how complex the language is, can understand those passages if they know the subject matter. And no matter how simple the language is, can't understand it if they're not familiar with the subject matter. So that was the first, and then I read up into the research, further research, and particularly research done by Walter Kinch and his various colleagues, that this relevant background knowledge is absolutely critical to comprehension. So having that knowledge and then also having dealt with some of the technical theoretical problems in theory of interpretation, which is what hermeneutics is, I felt I had an obligation to tell people, bring the news from the research front, and particularly on one occasion that put me over the edge on activism was an account from the data that came in from some research we did in a community college from minority students, where they could read perfectly well if the subject matter was familiar, but couldn't read about Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. It was the end of the Civil War, and these kids were in Richmond, Virginia, and you would think that would be a familiar topic to them. But it proved not to be a familiar topic. They couldn't understand it. It could have been about Hegel's philosophy. It could have been Greek. So that was disorienting to me. And that kind of experience, knowing what I knew from the research front, plus the observation that the schools had not been doing their jobs, well, that combination was what got me started.
And have the core knowledge schools which have sprung up and the schools which are following the core knowledge curriculum in part or in full, have they furnished you now with a sufficiently robust data set to help you advance the cause by referring to that data?
Yes, I mean, there are some, the data we have that's really important, it's not very rich because the education community has not wanted actually to evaluate core knowledge schools longitudinally. There is some of that going on now on a big scale. But the data we have by studying archival data. How did these students do over time compared with archival data from the control schools is very striking. They do much, much better. Controlling for demographics and all of that. But there's not a huge body of that because the special random assignment kind of research that people require. But let me mention another point that I think gets lost. So we have the research that we have is highly positive. But in addition, I don't think one should say that one should disparage the lab research that led us to this in the first place. If you're willing to follow a coherent logical argument from A to B, then you ought to say there's a huge research background behind what we're doing. In fact, far more research than anything being done currently under the skills approach to schooling.
Why do you think that the educational establishment remains largely unpersuaded of the benefits of teaching children core knowledge, not just in America, but here as well and elsewhere? France, God help us, is beginning to go in the other direction towards a more skills-based approach to education, away from a knowledge-based approach.
Yes, and they've been doing less good than they had been doing before. That's an interesting phenomenon. I noticed that in the PISA reports that France had been sort of going the wrong direction.
I'm now trying to start an école maternelle in London as they begin to close in Paris. But what do you think explains the extraordinary level of resistance, which goes way beyond a rational, reasonable appraisal of the evidence and of the arguments within the educational establishment?
I have to tell you about the American. I'm not familiar with the British educational establishment, but in the United States, there are historical reasons why everybody thinks the same way. When our education schools were growing in the late 19th century and early 20th century, all the teachers were populated by graduates of Teachers College, Columbia. They all came out with a similar, what we now call progressivist orientation. And it's been, and also that orientation was enforced within the ed school. Ed schools in the United States are not like departments of English or history over in arts and sciences, where dissent is theoretically anyway encouraged, and you're supposed to kill your intellectual fathers. Not so in education schools. There's a kind of sense that you are betraying the group if you do something heterodox. So there's a force for orthodoxy within the education world, and you are drummed out of the core and I have actually seen that. If you are an education professor and are trying to get tenure and are saying something unorthodox, then you're dismissed. So there's a kind of enforced thought model in the education world, and it's connected with a moral point of view. I mean, he said this is socially progressive. It's much more humane than the fact-based kind of education. So the anti-fact doctrine, particularly for early education, took hold early on and became totally dominant in our education schools. And I think it's a fact of intellectual history rather than, as you point out, rather than of logic.
One of the paradoxes of this is that even the very same professors of education who resist core knowledge on the grounds they think it will impede the development of critical and analytical skills, don't criticize or overanalyze the central beliefs of their own progressive agenda. I mean,
you're saying they don't engage in critical thinking?
They don't engage in critical thinking themselves about the progressive educational viewpoint. It's baffling, and it's what particularly baffling to me is that you'd think that that people in universities scholars, academics, that they would be less susceptible to groupthink. But actually, it turns out that the more intellectually developed you are, the more susceptible to groupthink you are.
Well, there's a theory enunciated in my knowledge first by Max Planck, who was distressed that all his fellow physics professors weren't accepting quantum theory. And he, in his autobiography, he made the remark that professors never change their minds. You have to wait until the old professors die and new people come along who haven't been indoctrinated in quite the same way. That's a long time to wait. And I don't wish any living education professors death, but that's the Planck principle, that you've been living by a certain set of slogans and theories. And you've been teaching this to generations of prospective teachers. Are you going to suddenly turn around and say, oh dear, no, I'm wrong. I told all those people the wrong kinds of things. It's not going to happen. And I think maybe the hope is that a wider public become knowledgeable about the state of cognitive science.
You clearly didn't set out to be a heretic, and yet, to a great extent, within the secular church of the educational establishment, you are a heretic. Have you enjoyed being cast in that role, or does it make you uncomfortable?
Well, I do think I found myself in that role enough times in my career to think that there must be something I like about it, but actually, that's not really the way it feels internally. When I first got into this subject matter, I thought, okay, all I have to do is write this article in the American Scholar. It was called Cultural Literacy. People will see that the logic and the evidence is that way, and I can then go back to hermeneutics. And so that was over 30 years ago, or something like that. Let's see, that came out in 83, I think. So yes, it's been 30 years, and I no, I didn't really want to go. In fact, I get a little bit upset when the logic of the argument just doesn't come in at all, and you get to be called a bad person because you're anti-multicultural. The truth is, I am a little bit. I'm certainly against teaching all kinds of multicultural materials without teaching in the United States anyway, the knowledge that binds people together as a community. I think that's the first duty of national schools, of public schools, to do that binding together.
And just finally, Professor Hirsch, how optimistic are you that your ideas will gradually be taken up and the argument over time will be won by you and your disciples? Are you less optimistic than you were at the beginning of your career now, or more optimistic because they've tried so many other things which clearly haven't worked, as you said earlier?
Well, I guess I have to be a little more optimistic than I was in the early 90s, because in the early 90s, we couldn't be having this conversation. There wouldn't be anything like this conversation. There would just be vigorous pros and cons and a vigorous polarization with all the bad people being in favor of Hirsch and all the good people being in favor of progressive principles. That's been moderated a little bit now, and so I guess I have to be a little hopeful.
I mean, you do have some pretty devoted adherents over here, but I remember one of them telling me that she'd held a meeting in her front room, in her not terribly big flat, of all the people that believed in core knowledge, and she said that she managed to fit all the teachers in England into the front room of her flat. But I believe that it's a growing movement, and eventually it will win the day.
That's very heartening, Toby. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed for the Sunday Times Education Festival.